Speak to Burkina Faso's sovereignty. They maintain their sovereignty. They make their decisions how they use their resources. They make their decisions who their resources go to for military support. That's their sovereign right.
If this were true, Langley wouldn't be in Kenya right now doing a cleanup tour. In his statement before the U.S. Senate,
Absolutely, Chairman. I see this, and I don't mind calling them out, but Captain Traoré and Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime.
he clearly condemned Captain Traoré for using gold reserves in exchange for protection of the junta regime. That's not a neutral statement. That's an accusation of corruption, not sovereignty. As you can see, Langley is doing damage control. He wants to appear respectful of Burkina Faso's sovereignty only after the African backlash. But the record shows, Washington doesn't respect African sovereignty unless it serves their strategic interest.
But my cautionary tale was just from a military perspective. That was a Senate Armed Services Committee asking me a direct question. Burkina Faso, a lot of great things going on to progress them forward, okay? But then when you look at the military part of it, knowing that that's the epicenter of global terrorism.
Let's be honest, this has been the epicenter of terrorism for nearly a decade. Where was this urgency before Traoré? From 2015 to 2022. Burkina Faso and its Sahel neighbors were on fire, over 2 million displaced, thousands dead, multiple governments collapsing. And Washington? Barely a whisper. No Senate testimonies, no media campaigns, no AFRICOM tours across Africa. But the moment Traoré kicks out France, aligns with Russia, and redirects gold away from Western banks, suddenly the region becomes a threat to global stability. This is not about terrorism. This is about losing control.
Resources going towards for the whole fight of terrorism in that country, period. They make their decisions though. That's their sovereignty, their sovereign right to make their decisions, what is appropriate, what's not. But I wanted to illuminate that is going in the wrong direction now. ISIS is getting stronger. JNIM is getting stronger. Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Maghreb is getting stronger in that country.
And do you think it's getting stronger after General Traoré took over?
It has. Just look at the numbers of attacks. It really has, since 2022. I've been tracking this since I took command.
Langley fails to say why. Why did attacks escalate in 2022? Because that's when Traoré took over and began cutting the West out. He expelled French troops. He denounced colonial control. He began re-nationalizing gold and strategic industries. That's when Western-backed insurgents reactivated. That's when regional terror spikes looked conveniently political. And that's when Washington suddenly woke up to the Sahel crisis.
And that threatens America's interest?
Say again?
Does that then threaten America's interests?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Because especially ISIS, and of course in East Africa is inextricably linked all the way to ISIS West Africa, ISIS Sahel, and there's going to be probably a move afoot for them to move and seek refuge within the line. So we have shared objectives, and we offer to work together with the Burkina government and border countries.
Too little, too late. Where was this offer when terrorists burned villages under Western watch? Where was AFRICOM when entire Sahel provinces fell to jihadists between 2017 to 2021? Burkina Faso remembers. Mali remembers. Niger remembers. Now, with Russian instructors, joint military drills, and Pan-African unity strengthening, Washington's help. is just a reactive play to remain relevant. Let's not forget what Langley revealed to the Senate.
That is all. All those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime.
That's the real voice of Washington, not this polished PR script from Kenya. In their eyes, sovereignty without submission is criminal. Military spending without US oversight is suspicious. Gold that doesn't pass through Western hands is illegitimate. And a president who partners with Russia, asserts independence, and unites African states under AES. That's a threat, not to stability, but to hegemony. Langley's statements are not just contradictions. They're a mirror showing the true panic in Washington. For years, the Sahel burned, and America looked away. Now that the flames threaten their influence, they call it terrorism. But what they truly fear is African liberation.
Mali, Niger, coastal West Africa countries, collective, because here's what these organizations do. Here's what these terrorist organizations do. They seek refuge in the seams or the borders of these countries and lets them thrive and grow, and lets them recruit, gain resources to carry on their illicit and nefarious activities against the populations of those people.
Langley is describing a security vacuum that existed long before Traoré, when the US, France, and ECOWAS had all the influence and failed to act decisively. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were falling apart under pro-Western regimes, but there was no AFRICOM alarm, no emergency conferences, no resource offers. So why now? Because the AES alliance closed those seams through coordinated military zones and tightened borders, and did it without US help. They even began cooperating with Russia, a move that signals the end of unilateral US dominance in the Sahel.
And what would America, perhaps AFRICOM, be prepared to do? Would you be considering an ouster like we saw with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya? Because there's still many Africans who are yet to recover from that. If this is a bigger threat, as you say, in Burkina Faso, what is AFRICOM prepared to do about it?
We do indications and warnings. There's a number of activities that we do, and we'll just go ahead and mention building institutional capacity. There's not going to be U.S. boots on the ground. Very, very small for exchange of ideas and training, exercises. Over time, that builds institutional capacity and capability in these armies.
That's not just misleading. It's disingenuous. AFRICOM trained Malian, Nigerian, and Burkinabe officers for years, and many of them defected, staged coups, or failed on the battlefield. Where was the long-term strength? AFRICOM's capacity building didn't stop the Sahel from collapsing. It preserved Western, friendly leaders while citizens suffered. Now that AES forces are pushing back the insurgents independently, Langley wants to reframe AFRICOM as a neutral partner. That's just PR.
There, AFRICOM, we are working towards a burden sharing and a burden shift for their independent operations. That's our goal. We have the shared objectives because these same terrorist groups can threaten our homeland. So we're in concert. I was just in African Lion over in Morocco. A number of countries working together.
Let's unpack this. If the goal was truly shared, why are AES nations cutting ties with the West? Why did Traoré say publicly that Burkina Faso's future cannot be dictated by foreign powers who abandoned us? The invitation to African Lion feels like a formality, a symbolic gesture to preserve optics, not a sincere attempt at partnership, especially since Washington has been quietly funding counter-AES propaganda and vilifying Traoré on US media and Senate floors.
Speaking of that, because the reaction out of the statements that you made about Burkina Faso were several African leaders feeling you are speaking on sovereignty issues that America shouldn't be. And as a result, there are those who see the role of AFRICOM as less of a partner in, the war against, shared threats, as you mentioned, and more of a protector of Western or American economic interests. that allows access to Africa's vast mineral resources, and as more of a paternalistic relationship than one of respect amongst peers. What would you respond to that?
I respond that there's others on the globe that do that. There's others on the globe that
Like
do
who?
that. Now, I'm not
Like
even
who,
bring it
General?
up. We should have even already know, okay? But I'm going to even bring that up.
Okay.
We respect their sovereignty. We respect their decisions. We respect their decisions of who they choose as a security partner. And then we measure the common denominator that's keeping these countries across the Sahel from progressing forward. You know, in 2050, you know, the largest workforce on the globe is going to come out of the continent of Africa. The youth need hope. They need peace and stability so they can hit their potentials. That's a long-range goal of AFRICOM as we look to help these countries set those conditions for stability and security so prosperity can be presented to all the populations and the youth.
And then comes the hook, the glaring contradiction. He continued, "There are others on this planet that act exactly as you've described. I won't name them, but we all know who they are. Here it is. Langley's most obvious lie. I won't name them, but we all know who they are. As you can see, Langley is doing damage control, pretending the US isn't one of the biggest resource extractors on the continent. But who built AFRICOM? Who funded proxy wars? Who backed regimes that signed away African gold, uranium and oil contracts? It wasn't China. It wasn't Russia. It was Washington. And now that Burkina Faso has redirected its gold flows away from the West and towards strategic autonomy, the US feels the sting of rejection. That's why Langley spoke so aggressively before the Senate. Captain Traoré is using those funds from the gold reserve in exchange for protection of the junta regime. This isn't about terror. It's about the US losing access to those funds. That's the real threat in Langley's eyes and Washington in general.
Pan-Africanism is real and it's strong, and there's an opportunity to come up on the global stage, and this continent can do it. That's what we really envision.
This is a patronizing pivot. You cannot preach Pan-Africanism while undermining AES unity. You cannot talk about Africa's rise while blacklisting Burkina Faso, smearing Traoré and pressuring Mali, Niger not to align with Russia. Pan-Africanism today is about sovereignty, gold independence, military self-reliance, and resisting external manipulation. And on all those fronts, AFRICOM has stood in the way, not beside it. Langley says AFRICOM respects sovereignty, but they condemn Traoré for using sovereign gold. They offer invitations while warning of threats. They praise Pan-Africanism, yet punish its practice. The truth is simple: America lost control in the Sahel, and now they call that loss a terrorist threat.
So you're not concerned about China and Russia expanding their military and economic influence across the continent?
We are concerned about it, yes.
What about it concerns you?
Well, you know, their influence. Their influence may not be looked upon as being a positive influence.
Of course they are. Not when the Sahel was in flames. Not when pro-Western regimes were failing and terrorists were overrunning borders. But now that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have turned eastward and begun reclaiming their security and sovereignty, suddenly Langley is concerned. This was never about African security. It's about African autonomy. And that autonomy is taking shape through mutually beneficial partnerships, not neo-colonial charity. With Russia, Burkina Faso signed a military cooperation agreement in 2023 that included the delivery of air defense systems, military training, and tactical equipment, all in exchange for state-level access to gold exploration, not exploitation. The terms were clear: no permanent Russian bases, no backdoor control, just security for sovereignty. With China, the Burkina government launched a $200 million infrastructure deal in early 2024, which included the construction of hospitals, roads, and a solar power facility near Ziniare. The contract emphasized local labor use, tech transfer, and long-term maintenance shared by both governments. Compare that to over a century of Western extraction, where France, the US, and their allies drained the Sahel of gold, uranium, and rare earths, leaving behind broken institutions and mass poverty. This is not just a pivot in alliances. It's a correction of history. Let's translate that. By influence, Langley means competition, and by not positive, he means not profitable for the US for decades. Washington had a monopoly on shaping African outcomes. Now it's being challenged, politically, economically, militarily. That's the problem.
For who? For America or for Africa?
Well, for Africans, okay?
Langley tries to disguise American interests as African concern, but the people aren't buying it. If Washington was so worried about Africans, where was AFRICOM when jihadists overran entire provinces in Burkina Faso? Where was this concern when French drones bombed villagers in Mali under the banner of counter-terrorism? The only thing that changed is the flag flying over African cooperation agreements. And it's no longer American.
And then, so Americans have that in mind, that for the African people and across all countries, be able to hit their maximum potential and independence and sovereignty and also freedoms by rules-based international order.
Let's be clear. That phrase, rules-based international order, is code for US-defined order. It means African elections the US approves of.
Chaos at a polling booth in Lagos as shots with
African leaders the US can control. African resources the US can access. Western powers are less concerned about whether a president is constitutional or not. They care more about securing access to strategic resources. They routinely ignore the voices of oppressed populations when their interests are being served. Take the cases of Ivory Coast and Togo. For example, in Togo, the Gnassingbé family has ruled since 1967, over 5 decades, while in Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara controversially amended the constitution to extend his time in power. These regimes remain in place not because of democratic legitimacy, but because they maintain favorable ties with foreign powers. Burkina Faso under Captain Traoré isn't following that script. And that's why AFRICOM is suddenly worried about alignment.
Do you have a counter strategy?
Do we have a counter strategy as far as to
China, Russia, their presence, because you say it doesn't align with the shared values?
Well, what we watch is it does not, the continent of Africa does not need to be militarized, let's put it that way. Does not need to be militarized. So we watch, as far as security agreements and what does it mean? Is it really for the stability to fight the threats of a African country, or is it for them and their ability to establish a global hegemon of basis?
Now this is peak hypocrisy. AFRICOM has over 40 outposts across the continent. It conducts joint exercises, intelligence ops, drone surveillance, and counterinsurgency training. That is militarization. But the moment Africa starts militarizing itself, on its own terms, with its own partners, the US, cries fall. It's not militarization they fear. It's independent militarization, especially when it shuts the door on Washington. Murmurs erupted during his interview with Ivan. Kenyans were already saying, "We as a country are disappointed in our leaders for hosting such a traitor on our soil. We are woke, and we are not stupid anymore. Africa for Africans. My people, this wasn't just frustration, it was fury. A US general came to lecture Africans on how to be free, while representing a military machine that props up dictators, arms militias, and bleeds Africa's goldfields dry." Langley didn't bring clarity. He brought confirmation that AFRICOM isn't about African progress. It's about protecting Western leverage. Again, they said, "We don't recognize this colonial military puppet. And just because he looks like us, doesn't mean we identify with him. The mask is off. The color of your skin doesn't make you an ally. It's your allegiance that counts. AFRICOM's black face doesn't fool the continent. The people can smell betrayal, even when it comes in camouflage. On April 30th, 2025, Africans worldwide held peaceful protests in support of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and against General Langley's accusations. From Accra, Ghana, to Rabat, Morocco. From Abuja, Nigeria, to London, UK, they shouted, "Viva Ibrahim Traoré! Long live our captain!" Why do they cheer for Traoré while booing Langley? Because Traoré stayed with the people when bullets flew. Because he redirected gold to build roads and hospitals, not to foreign banks. Because he stood firm when NATO puppets begged for mercy. Traoré is not perfect, but he's ours. This was never just a TV interview. It was a turning point, a reflection of what the new Africa looks like. Loyal and liberated. Africa is no longer silent, no longer submissive, and absolutely no longer for sale. Langley came to sugarcoat and do damage control without direct apology, but he left exposed, a symbol of fading empire in a continent that's waking up fast. The era of foreign puppets and planted narratives. Finished. The people are in charge now. The gold stays here. The truth stays loud. And the future wears African boots, not foreign badges. If you feel the fire of this awakening, don't just watch it, spread it. Join the resistance. Raise the voice. This is Black Rebellion, and we are just getting started. Like and subscribe for more in-depth content like this.